I'm going to invoke some measure of personal privilege um, and introduce the person who I've asked to introduce someone else. Because I think many of you know him and will want to express your appreciation to him. 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, when I was exactly half my age, I came to Baylor University to study philosophy to take a master's degree. And I came from the University of Texas, where they had toughened me up intellectually. They certainly done their intellectual formation part with me, and that was why I was there. But I found at Baylor University in the philosophy department a really remarkable group of faculty who took an interest in me, and I was assigned to become the teaching assistant of Dr. Michael Beatty. And I will just say that from day one, I'd never met anyone like Beatty. 25 years later, it holds true. I'd never met anyone who was as gifted, really, as a philosophy teacher. And I think that's true still. I'd never met anyone with the passion that he had. I'd never met anyone who had the sort of genuine care that he did for students. So I was his TA. By the way, he's if you need any Latin ever pronounced, Beatty is your guy. He really pronounces Latin words very well, too. Just ask him to pronounce Gaudium et Spes or something like that. I was able to take a course from him on was titled Social Philosophy, but what we were looking at was Christian higher education, the theology, the history. We read Marsden's book. It had just come out, The Soul of the American University. And that course, it changed my life. And I began to think about the importance of places like Baylor. And I began to have these phenomenal conversations with Dr. Beatty. And I began to think about this very much in terms of my own vocation. He planted the seed for me, and he has devoted many years to church-related higher education at Baylor, but elsewhere. And he's had tremendous leadership and servant leadership with the Lilly Fellows program. And of course, he was the founding director of the Institute for Faith and Learning. So Beatty's going to be around for some time, but I don't know that we'll host a national conference with the LFP. We last did it in 1997. I don't think I'll be around in 22 years to do it again. I may be alive, but I probably won't be here. But I wanted to take this opportunity to express for me what I think many of you share, which is a deep admiration and appreciation for Michael Beatty.
Thank you, Darren, and thank you, friends. It's both a great pleasure and a real honor to introduce our next speaker, Thomas S. Hibbs. Tom is my friend, a former Baylor colleague, a fellow Notre Dame alumnus, and now president of the University of Dallas. Originally from Washington, D.C., Tom studied business for 2 years at the University of Maryland before immigrating to Dallas in 1980 to join the seminary at Holy Trinity. Those of us who know Tom well can report, with due respect to all, that neither his business studies nor training in the seminary left any recognizable mark on his intellectual or practical life. Don't dismay. Tom is well-formed. He received his BA in English and an MA in philosophy from the University of Dallas. At Notre Dame, He was and his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. At Notre Dame, he was influenced in many positive ways by the work of and friendship with, among others, three very important philosophers, teachers, and friends, Ralph McInerney, David Solomon, and Alistair McIntyre. Happily, to Baylor's great benefit, from 2003 to 2019, Tom served as Dean of the Honors College and Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Culture at Baylor. Don Schmeltikoff, former provost, Scott Moore, former chair of Great Text, and I, soon be, thanks be to God, former chair of the philosophy department, like to claim some shared credit for Tom's coming to Baylor. I think we share a good eye for character and intelligence and genuine liberal learning. The Honors College and its 4 programs at Baylor have become a profoundly positive influence on Baylor's intellectual and moral life through Tom's good leadership. In another and much, much younger life, Tom was a tutor at Thomas Aquinas College for 3 years before moving to Boston College, where he taught for 13 years as full professor and chair of the philosophy department before coming to Baylor. George Weigel, Distinguished Senior Fellow and William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, says, I quote, "Tom Hibbs is one of the finest Catholic educators in America. A first-rate intellect wedded to administrative ability and deep commitment to the church." And I agree with all of that. But I would say that he's one of the finest thinkers, writers, and educators in America writ large. His friends and colleagues at Baylor are pleased for the University of Dallas. Nonetheless, we lament Baylor's loss and our own, as his friends, sharing common commitments to the life of the mind and to the importance of Christian higher education in North America and in Texas. Tom, we welcome you to this podium. We recognize that we're about to experience an intellectual banquet. Come.
I thought when Darren was talking, he made Mike sound dead. I sounded even more posthumous than you. It's great to be here. Great to be back in Waco. We still have a condo not too far down the street, so we had to come back for a celebration. Anyhow, the great pilgrimage. I don't know. Stat I heard last year that there were more visitors to the silos than to the Chip and Joanna fixer-upper location than there were to the Alamo last year, which is great for Waco, but not really good for civilization. I'm glad to be back. It's great to be at the IFL conference again. It's great to be with the Lilly Fellows program again. It's great to see former Provost Don Schmeltikoff, who is responsible for hiring me. So if you got issues about what I did at Baylor, you can blame him. And folks from the Provost office currently, Jim Benninghoff, Nancy Brickhouse. Nancy, I worked for about 2 months, and she said, "I'm glad we got rid of that guy." So really good to be back here. Darren, thank you for your leadership. Thanks to Vicki and your whole team for everything that you do. It's also great in the Lilly Fellows program to see Joe Creech. Carol Simon and I spent 3 years together as faculty mentors. Good to see her and Pat Byrne, whom I know through there, but it was a colleague back at Boston College way back in the old days. It's great to have Matt Waltz and Tom Josowitz here from UD. I think I've mentioned 82% of the people in the room, so I better get to my talk. But the other great thing about having a place here is that when I got here this morning, after driving down, my wife was driving, I actually had a printer that I could use in my house, which is a really cool thing. So since I revised the paper coming down, I don't know that it's any better, but it's about a page shorter. In 2017, start with 2 events, one in 2017, one in 2018. 2017, Middlebury political science professor Allison Stanger had agreed to moderate a scheduled lecture by the controversial American Enterprise Institute scholar Charles Murray, in the hope of having an open exchange of ideas after there were initial protests to his appearing on campus. When Murray and Stanger entered the lecture hall, students were chanting and yelling obscenities. Stanger, who was herself a liberal Democrat, goes on to describe what alarmed her most. Those who wanted the event to take place made eye contact with me. Those intent on disrupting it steadfastly refused to do so. They couldn't look directly at me because if they had, they would have seen another human being. Unable to proceed with the public lecture, they moved to another site where the conversation could be live streamed. As they were exiting the building, they were attacked by a group of students. I feared for my life, wrote Stanger. Once we got into the car, protesters climbed on it, hitting the windows and rocking the vehicle. Stanger suffered a concussion. Meanwhile, the administration at Middlebury was slow to assign blame, and some remained disappointed at their half-hearted response to physical violence being inflicted on a female professor. In 2018, at a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, a rally arising in part from anger over the removal of Confederate statues, which itself had been prompted by the Charleston church shootings. The self-described white supremacist, James Alex Fields Jr., rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters and killed one person and injured 40 others. The day before this homicide occurred, violence was barely averted on the campus of the University of Virginia. Chad Wellman, who's visited Baylor before, a professor at UVA who had just taken up residence on campus with students, described what he saw. I opened my kitchen door to chants and flickering lights. After telling my kids to stay inside, I scrambled over a stone wall and down a brick stairwell to find torch-bearing men and women clad in white polo shirts and khakis chanting, "You will not replace us," and anti-black. They marched in cadence 2 by 2, as far as I could see. This group, led by UVA alumnus and white supremacist Richard Spencer, made its way to the symbolic center of campus, the statue of Thomas Jefferson. A brawl between marchers and counter-protesters was broken up by police. These examples, probably two of the most dramatic examples of the last few years, illustrate the ways in which university campuses have on occasion in recent years become sites of protest, recrimination, and identity politics. Instead of modeling for the civic order and producing students capable of rational disagreement, universities are sometimes today characterized by shrill vituperation and the silencing of opponents. Not yet rivaling the violence on campuses in the 60s, recent examples of the substitution of force for argument underscore the potential of our culture wars to become something more than metaphorical. Meanwhile, universities large and small across the country, humanities curricula, sometimes even science programs, are being slashed or radically reduced. This tendency highlights the abandonment, despite the ongoing appeal in recruitment brochures of universities concerning the rhetoric of educating whole persons, highlights the abandonment of substantive commitments in undergraduate education to the humanities, which have traditionally been seen as vehicles in the preparation of students for civic engagement. Examples of these types, the two that I mentioned, are often cited in contemporary criticisms of contemporary higher education. In The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt take aim at what they call the three great untruths propagated on college campuses. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. Life is a battle between good people and evil people. Some liberal defenders of universities have taken note. In The Splintering of the American Mind, Identity, Politics, Inequality, and Community on Today's College Campuses, William Egginton worries that increasing attention to identity politics and the movement away from any kind of common curriculum undermines the possibility of university education continuing to produce students fit for democratic self-governance. While in some circles, there's alarm about the decline of university humanities programs, not everyone thinks there's cause for worry. Some shrug. In a Wall Street Journal piece, Adam Kirsch insists universities are not responsible for or capable of creating a living humanistic culture. Scholarship is an important part of that culture, but not its engine. That's certainly true. Still, some of Kirsch's claims are questionable. For example, he writes, students are judged by what they can readily articulate in the classroom. But in life, it's what we don't know how to express that draws us to read, think, listen to music, or look at art. Of course, it's only bad humanities teachers that focus on what students are fully able to articulate. Good humanities teachers help students to express the complexity of what they're encountering and fostering in them a deepening sense of mystery and wonder, not its vanishing. Kirsch also says the habit of seeing universities as the main or even sole custodians of humanistic culture isn't just inaccurate, it's bad for universities themselves. When we consider the university the only place where society can explicitly formulate its visions of truth, beauty, and justice, it's no wonder that campuses become fierce ideological battlegrounds for students, faculty, and outside observers alike. That may be, it's probably an overstatement even for our time, and it may be contingently true in our time and in certain places in our time. But of course, one of the peculiar features of our time in higher education is that outside the sciences, which themselves could flourish in research centers completely independently of universities, and in skills-based disciplines that lead directly to careers, most universities have a very difficult time saying why it is that they're offering what they offer, let alone how the various and increasingly specialized disciplines fit together into any kind of coherent unity. First cites the current flourishing and growth of private organizations and events for reading and the arts as proof that appreciation of that the humanities are flourishing outside of universities and without their support. In fact, I would go one step further than Kirsch and say it's not just the production of humanistic culture, but also very often its appreciation that occurs at the margins, outside the preeminent institutions of the modern world, including universities. I should say that this theme that I've been working on that forms the title of this talk, Liberal Education at the Margins, came to me as I was rereading a review of Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind by Eva Braun, the longtime dean at St. John's College in Annapolis, the great books college. And her complaint about Bloom was that Bloom had been looking for it in the wrong places, that the sort of education he was after has never flourished in the university, research university setting. It's always flourished most at the margins, in small liberal arts colleges. Consider the following quite disparate set of examples. The Mission High San Francisco Dante Club, organized by a public high school teacher and composed mainly of high school students who had immigrated from Mexico, Central America, and Asia, met weekly to discuss Dante. And there have been some studies of sort of longitudinal studies of the college results and even careers of the students who were in this group. The practical immediate result was a high college acceptance and attendance rate, but also a greater attention to the way in which virtues and vices shape our character and our destinies. One student observed that the club was less like school than it was like hanging out with friends, discussing books. Or consider the widespread practice of reading great literature with the incarcerated. In one program, the reading of Russian literature allowed prisoners to grapple with fundamental questions. Who am I? Why am I here? How should I die? These programs have the practical benefits of decreasing recidivism and increasing social skills and civic engagement. But they do so by engaging those in prison, not merely as criminals, but as full human beings, capable of being moved by great works of literature. Or consider the role played, going further back in time, by the writings of the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus, whose thought focuses on establishing, at least in part, clear lines of demarcation between what is within one's control and what is not, and focusing one's attention on the former. In the survival of James Stockdale, a senior Navy pilot shot down over Vietnam in 1965 and held as a prisoner in the infamous Hanoi Hilton. These are but a few examples of the way in which liberal education often finds willing students at the margins of mainstream society and in situations of deprivation. In their souls, longing continues to be kindled. Now, there's nothing about liberal education that mandates its location at the margins. Versions of it have informed mainstream education and been promoted by those in positions of influence, prestige, and power. But there are, I think, two reasons why education, liberal education, might be apt to migrate to the margins. One has to do with the disposition of souls, of the soul of students, and the other has to do with inhospitable institutional structures. First, for liberal education to truly take hold in the soul of a student, there must be some felt need and awareness of a lack in that student. Those who experience deprivation of some sort or another might be more apt to experience the need for liberal education simply because they're more aware of deprivation. Consider, for example, the life and thought of Azar Nafisi, whose best-selling Reading Lolita in Tehran is a memoir of her time under Iranian rule as an underground teacher of a group of young Iranian women, with a curriculum consisting mostly of forbidden Western literary texts. In an account that is at once beautiful and deeply moving, Nafisi makes a case for the power of these texts to keep human longing alive, and thus to subvert the aspirations of a totalitarian regime. In a subsequent book, after moving to America, The Republic of Imagination, Nafisi wonders at the indifference of Americans to their own intellectual and literary heritage, an indifference that she fears, as Orwell did before her, might endanger the democratic ideal. In totalitarian countries, liberal education, she says, is a basic need. It enables one to reclaim an identity always under threat. Those who have suffered censorship, jail, and torture because they have pursued an education have a profound sense of the significance of great works. But what about ordinary Americans who are products of mainstream American education? Nafisi questions, do they even know what they're missing? How can we rekindle the hunger? To put matters in these terms is to begin to raise the great question of liberal education, of how we ought to live, the question of what constitutes better and worse ways of life for the animals such as we are. The etymology of the word education means to be led out or led forth. It is not enough on this view to say what one wants to be liberated from, although that is indispensable. It's also necessary to offer some sort of account of that into which the sort of life we are led by education. W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I'll have more to say about in a moment, memorably puts it in The Souls of Black Folk, education is not about earning meat, but about the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes, which the students of college here can see as they walk back and forth to their dorm. More succinctly, negative liberty is insufficient for education. Second, such an education can be pushed to the margins because institutional forces in modernity, in particular, make it difficult for it to exist in those institutions. The dominant technocratic models of rationality in modernity generate practices and pedagogies that are technical, quantitative, and highly specialized. Moreover, in certain strains of Enlightenment modernity, there is a belief that once we have abandoned the superstitions of the past and set ourselves on a course of scientific rationality, moral and political blindness could be eradicated. When he argues that knowledge, at least the sort of knowledge afforded by academic study, is not to be equated with virtue, John Henry Newman, whose writings have informed so many defenses of liberal education in the last century, was working against the grain of Enlightenment views of education. In his fine study of Newman, Paul Shrimpton writes, the whole foundation of Bentham's Utilitarian University College in London, which he takes Newman to be thinking of, was premised on the idea that knowledge does make men better morally. As early as the 1830s, Newman was a consistent critic of this fallacy of the march of the mind. These theorists for Newman are caught in the grips of a theory about the power of theory. They suppose that our true excellence, he writes, comes not from within, but from without, not wrought out through personal struggle and suffering, but following upon a passive exposure to influences over which we had no control. Newman repudiates the determinism at the root of this position and the ignoring of moral struggle, the development of conscience, and the slow development of human character through habitual action. He is appalled at the astonishing naivete about the nature of evil. In one of the most beautiful and boldest passages in Idea of a University, he writes, "Quarry the granite rock with razors, or moor the vessel with a thread of silk. Then may you hope with such keen and delicate instruments as human knowledge and human reason to contend against those giants, the passion and the pride of man." Newman was acutely aware of the blindnesses to which we are prone as humans. Newman thought the traditional religious account of evil was more cogent than that of Enlightenment rationalism. And this puts him at the margins of the dominant 19th century culture of philosophy and education. But he was also at the margins of the most influential religious views of education, at least in Ireland, during the time he was founding rector of University College Dublin. Newman resisted what he took to be the desire of Irish prelates, get a load of this line, to have a population of peasants ruled by a patriotic priesthood patriarchically. Wow. Of course, Newman holds that theology is a legitimate, indeed indispensable academic discipline, even as he insists that the residential collegiate community is the proper arena for the formation of character in moral and spiritual life. But Newman insisted the university is a preparation for this world. It is not a convent. It is not a seminary. Newman fights against multiple kinds of anti-intellectualism, careerist, civic, and religious. In America, I would argue, the great tragic counter to Enlightenment optimism can be found in the writings of African American authors who warn about the multiple and insidious ways in which we can be enslaved, bound, incapable of seeing ourselves and others, often adopting a contrarian or even stronger negative stance toward canonical texts and developing quite independent modes of engaging antecedent traditions. African American authors are among the greatest American defenders of liberal education. I can't find a better statement of liberal education by an American than the one that W.E.B. Du Bois pens in The Souls of Black Folk in the chapter The Wings of Atlanta. This fact underscores a claim that I was just making, I think, that the appreciation of liberal education is often greatest at the margins, among those who have been deprived not just of education, but also of various types of freedom. Contemporary inheritors of traditions of liberal education often, it must be admitted, do not know what they have inherited and have on occasion ignored it or dismissed it as oppressive. On the last point, it's important to acknowledge that the text, inquiries, and pedagogical structures of such an education can and have been bent to serve repressive ends. But included, at least in most of these traditions of liberal education, are correctives to its misuse. In fact, significant writers, male and female, at the margins of the dominant culture, have appreciated and embraced the traditions of liberal learning because they recognize its commitment to the complex goods of human freedom. Their varied backgrounds and the divergent trajectories of their lives during and after their experience of liberal learning underscore what one author calls the unpredictable impact of traditional liberal education. Literature, this same author goes on to write, is not a political drug with predictable effects. Understood in these terms, liberal education is not so much an ornament for an aristocratic class as it is a necessity for true freedom. An illustration of these points can be had in an unduly neglected text of W.E.B. Du Bois, a commencement address that he gave at a public school in Washington, D.C. in 1907, not long after a devastating earthquake had leveled San Francisco. Du Bois seizes on the event as an occasion for considering St. Francis as a model for civilization. Why, Du Bois asked, should we ponder the life of the medieval saint? Why go so far back in time to understand where we are today? By fixing in our memories the life of Francis as presented by Du Bois, we will come to appreciate what Du Bois calls a certain attitude toward wealth and distinction, and the need and place of human training to emphasize this attitude. Francis, according to Du Bois, understood that there were material and bodily needs, and that the satisfying of these needs was a good, indeed an indispensable good. But he was convinced that there were greater wants for human service and sympathy, for knowledge and inspiration, for hope and truth and beauty. Dispositions and virtues, these habits of self-renunciation and attentions to things and persons other than oneself illumine our blindness and free us to some extent from being bound to the slavish pursuit of physical comfort and pleasure, honor and power, wealth and the accumulation of material goods. Francis understood the tension between great and greater wants. To satisfy spiritual starvation requires some degree of renunciation of material goods. Education certainly involves the cultivation of a sense of the relative importance of these different wants and goods. But for Du Bois, education is principally about what Francis' life was about at its core, a quest to read life's riddle. That's the language he also uses in The Souls of Black Folk to describe liberal education, reading the riddle of existence, and tell the world its true unraveling. Here we move beyond not just skills, but even intellectual virtue. We are in the realm of the good of a whole life, understood as a social and political life, not the life of an isolated inquirer. Without much book learning, Francis found a center to his life in relation to which he understood its whole and its parts. He faced, according to Du Bois, roughly the same human condition we face, and posed the questions each of us must, or at least ought to ask. Their relevance has not faded. It is striking that in response to a cataclysmic event of destruction, the San Francisco earthquake, Du Bois turns to the past for perspective and illumination. Does not focus on the technological resources of modernity, the way in which better building codes, forecasting, or improved construction might enable us in the future to mitigate the destruction. There's no sense he would be against those. He does not look to a future in which such tragedy will no longer exist. Such events, it seems for Du Bois, will come. Du Bois resists in advance the technocratic paradigm of problem solving that would come to dominate America's public culture in the years during and after World War II. He thus anticipates what a host of public intellectuals from the 1940s were anxious about, namely that the West might lose by winning. Led by a coterie of technocratic experts and fueled by enormous technological power, the West was growing inordinately confident in its capacity to defeat any opponent. There's a great book by a Baylor faculty member, Alan Jacobs, called The Year of Our Lord, 1943, Christian Humanism in an Age of Crisis, which treats of this period and examines writers like Maritain, C.S. Lewis, Hannah Arendt, and W.H. Auden. They worried that the means of victory, superior technology and technical expertise, might undermine the things for which the West was allegedly fighting. Subjection to technofideism, which is a term that Harvard philosopher of science Naomi Oreskes uses in an introduction to St. Francis's Laudato Si encyclical. Technofideism could itself lead to a form of totalitarianism. Du Bois does not develop this argument, but it's quite clear that he is not interested, at least in this speech, in going down that path. Du Bois attends not to a future void of tragedy, but on a lesson from the past. He invites his audience to pause tonight and listen to the old story and learn the life lesson it contains. Francis' life is a response to the deepest and most enduring questions of the human soul. It is also an embodiment of the sort of discipline, the types of renunciation necessary even to see the question clearly, let alone tell the world its true unraveling. Stressing Francis' theme of taking poverty as a bride, Du Bois says, the lesson of Francis is not the renunciation of wealth and the deification of poverty. It is, on the contrary, simply this great truth. The work of the world is to satisfy the world's wants. Now, the world wants material wealth, but this is not all, or even the greater part of its need. It wants human service and sympathy. It wants knowledge and inspiration, hope and truth and beauty. Francis came to see the privileges of wealth, status, power, and pleasure as things that kept him bound. He was their slave and was ashamed that he had, in the words of Socrates, given more care for the body than the soul, and had devoted himself with greater energy to the possession of wealth, reputation, and honors. The sense of a hierarchy of goods raises the question of the proper response to the inevitable conflict between lower and higher. Liberal education makes us aware of a range of goods, potential conflicts, and initiates us into a study of exemplary types or antitypes. A standard criticism of any such hierarchy is that it can be, and in fact has been, used to inculcate in members of subordinate or marginalized classes an acquiescence to their condition. This criticism is a variation on the standard criticism from Marx that religion is the opiate of the people. In this case, the appeal to hierarchy would be seen to counsel the marginalized that so long as they have spiritual, allegedly higher goods, they should be content with other sorts of deprivation, physical, legal, political. It is important to see that Du Bois's account of Francis moves in an opposite direction. The sacrifice is not imposed upon the lower classes, but is imposed upon those who already possess physical goods and social or political privilege. Known for his own deep-seated critique of capitalism, Du Bois here insists no doctrine of universal selfishness will ever reform society. That Du Bois could deploy St. Francis not only to inspire ordinary American citizens, but to also undergird a critique of contemporary economic and political practice is instructive. The life of St. Francis presented here is deeply countercultural. He stands athwart our individualism, our indifference to the great questions about how we ought to live, and our tenacious pursuit of material comfort. Yet he is supposedly a standard figure in the canon of exemplary Western lives. Du Bois's account belies the claim that Western thought is monolithic and that its study simply reinforces settled contemporary biases and prejudices. The careful study of figures and texts from what we are apt to call our tradition often reveals how little we actually understand them. Scholars and teachers make such figures and texts come alive in the present in a way that puts into question settled, unconscious assumptions. There was a related point, a caution, in fact, about the language of the other, which has become so pervasive in contemporary critical and social thought. Sometimes such language is deployed in such a way that otherness is assumed to be radically or wholly other. But there, and I'm not going to go into them here, there are considerable conceptual difficulties with this extreme postmodern understanding of otherness. Two extremes, I would argue. That of the claim that we have immediate, easy access to the other, and that of the impossibility of access mirror one another and undermine the possibility of education as an actual encounter. Moderate skepticism, I would urge, of the sort practiced by Pascal is the answer to both extremes. It undermines our confidence that we already or easily can comprehend the other, even as it suggests that we do not know enough to be certain that access is impossible. Both views seek to avoid the difficult, detailed work of translation. It is indeed an irony that as we celebrate diversity in the curriculum, the commitment to student mastery of foreign languages and hence to the careful habit of learning how to translate has notably declined. In an essay on the Contemporary Research University, Alistair McIntyre makes the case for an education in cultures foreign to the ones in which one has been raised. He captures nicely, I think, an alternative to the two extremes that I just described. Concerned with the difficulty of how we can come to terms with cultures radically different from our own, so that not only intellectually and imaginatively we learn as far as we can to speak and their inhabitants speak, to see as they see, and to think as they think. Such learning involves coming to understand ourselves, not as we customarily do, but as they understand us. And it at once raises the question of how we are to decide between their understanding of us and our own understanding of us, between their evaluations and ours, in all those cases where there are conflicting and incompatible claims. Yet this question cannot be fruitfully formulated or seriously asked until we have assimilated to some significant degree the language, the way of life and thought, the works of literature and other arts of some other particular alien culture. So we have to learn to begin by learning, say, Mandarin or Japanese or Arabic. Another helpful understanding of otherness that I think is compatible, at least in this section of her writings, with McIntyre's can be had in Toni Morrison's The Origin of the Other, in which she begins by underscoring the way defining someone as other sets up a distance between self and other. The act of distancing has two functions, according to Morrison. One can be the reduction of the other to the subhuman as a means of affirming the humanity of the self, its moral and superior value. The second is to exclude the possibility of sympathy with the stranger, and thus to cut off the possibility that one could become the stranger. Morrison's deeper point here is that each one of us already is at least implicitly and potentially a litany of strangers. He writes, there are no strangers, only versions of ourselves, many of which we have not embraced, most of which we wish to protect ourselves from. She adds, the stranger is not foreign, but random, not alien, but remembered, already known. The role of literature, according to Morrison, is not only to break down our aversion to encountering the other, it also invites the recognition that the other is, contrary to what some contemporary theorists urge, never wholly other. Without something like Morrison's thesis about the ultimate non-otherness of the other, it's hard to see how the encounter of and with the other could even occur. Du Bois invites his audience to listen to this old story. Turning to the past is a way of reminding us of both what needs preserving and what might be missing in the present. It's also a way of uncovering what was deeply wrong and disordered in the past. But authors and figures from the past can be as alien to us and thus constitute others for us as authors from quite different contemporary cultures. As Bill McClay puts it, liberal education often seeks a revival of the present by a recovery of the past. The forgetfulness of this is what creates a crisis for modern education, as Hannah Arendt so ably develops the idea in her essays Between Past and Future. But the assumption here seems to be, and it's a questionable assumption, that we stand over against the past, somehow independent of it, or at least independent enough from it to be able to make of it an object of scientific study and to dispose of it. The past is thus concluded and alien, unconnected with the present and the future. But this, as some contemporary authors have argued, is nothing more than self-certifying liberal progressive optimism. Such optimism is undercut in much of our imaginative art, from science fiction plots where enlightenment progress leads to ignorance and regress, to contemporary film noir, in which the project of escaping from the past is a dangerous illusion, and in which the future emerges paradoxically and devastatingly out of the past. The recovery of tradition or traditions is not a matter of bowing before and repeating the sayings of predecessors, or is it a matter of affirming a monolithic culture? There's simply too much disagreement for it to be adored or implemented as a whole. There's no singular past. Instead, there are multiple histories and narratives, just as there are diverse arguments and mutually incompatible visions of the good. Thus, there's no, as Remy Braga has argued, there's no singular the West. Makes an important point about the West, namely the attempt to seal off the West from non-Western sources and influences involves a dream of primitive purity that he argues in his study of the Middle Ages was alien to that culture. If Braga is right, then both the deconstructionists and many of the defenders of Western civilization are using inadequate categories. Is it any surprise that the demise of liberal education in our time coincides with historical amnesia in our public life, indeed in our most important institutions, higher education. This erodes our sense of where we are in relation to the past, even as it diminishes our capacity to name what is missing or what we have lost. Ralph Ellison notes the deleterious effect of what he calls the tradition of forgetfulness, of moving on, of denying the past, of converting the tragic realities of ourselves, but most often of others, into comedy. Not high comedy, farcical comedy. Serious commitment to education involves, as Hannah Arendt brilliantly argues, sorting through and making decisions about what from the past should be handed on to the next generation. Any curriculum must choose from among a myriad options and thus exclude some things for the sake of including others. Every curriculum is an implicit judgment that some things are more worthy of a student's time than are others, at least at this moment in their education. Here we face a set of paradoxes regarding education in a republic, to borrow the title of Eva Braun's fine book. On the one hand, liberal education has to do with the conservation and handing on of what is of value in the past, at least of things that ought to be debated about the past. On the other hand, our politics tends to regard the past as something that has been or should be surpassed and is preoccupied with the present and the future. To that tension, we should add another. Liberal education, whatever instrumental ends it might serve, is about learning, at least to some extent, what is desirable for its own sake. But democratic politics and capitalist economics are focused on instrumental goods and tend to see ends as matters of merely private preference. Our contemporary politics and economics thus make it harder to experience and identify what Nafisi calls enduring longings. The result is cultural amnesia and what Pope Francis calls, in that encyclical that I already mentioned, a throwaway culture. In education, we are situated, as Arendt puts it, between past and future. And I want to end with this quote from her. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token, save it from that ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them merely to their own devices. Not to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. Such preparation of the young requires that we take ownership of the world and take upon ourselves the responsibility of passing on from the past that which we judge to be necessary for sustaining our common life. The abdication of such responsibility is to fail to care for our common life and our offspring. It's a form of child abandonment. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, I just want to thank you for that talk. I really, really enjoyed it. But I was interested in your comments on St. Francis of Assisi specifically. I guess I thought it was interesting using him as a model for liberal education or for the educated person because, well, in part because he himself was very suspicious of education. So there are accounts of him discouraging or forbidding his brothers to learn to read, basically, because he saw it as a marker of status. He saw it as a potential, occlusion, something that could occlude their development as persons, their development as Christians, basically. And I think when you interact with liberal arts tradition, you see all kinds of legacies of those attempts to construct canons that exclude other things, right? To construct certain things. And I think how, again, as someone who is, very committed to my own liberal education, how can we kind of as educators be aware of those the places where it can actually occlude development, and how can we avoid those, I guess?
Really good question. And you have lots of different Francises. Du Bois is there
Yeah.
alongside the spirituals and Bonaventure, alongside Rossellini and Zeffirelli's film versions. You got lots of different Francis. The latest one is Pope Francis's Francis in Laudato Si, which I think actually comes closest to the real Francis, but even saying the real Francis probably. So I think this is a really important question. I think it's something that in the passages I touched on from Newman doesn't agree with Francis on that fully, certainly. But Newman is aware of the problem, right? Because in that passage that I mentioned from Newman, this insistence, which sometimes strikes those of us who are, as the Lilly Fellows program is, concerned about uniting university culture and character formation, it can strike us that Newman is detached or that he gets only part of a picture when he says that knowledge is not virtue and the end of education, at least academic education, is to know the truth in its complexity and unity. So I think that what Newman's worried about there is what I hinted at in the passage, the quote from Shrimpton. Newman is concerned, and in this he seems to me to be a good Aristotelian. He's concerned that we not confuse, as Aristotle warns us in the opening of the Ethics, that we not confuse a knowledge of the science or discipline of ethics with actually being good, right? He's also aware, as we are, and as our students sometimes are shocked to discover in us as faculty, that simply because we know a few things and can talk a good game, it doesn't mean that we're really good people, right? And sometimes students can be so in awe of, and all of us were, right, at some point. That's why we ended up going down the path that we went down, most of us, at least the people who were involved in the Lilly Fellows program. We can be in awe of people who seem to have such a knowledge of, not indifferent matters, but of great literature, great theology, great art. And yet then we discover that some of those people are deeply disordered and corrupt. And Newman, in a sense, is warning us of that at the outset, right? That these are not the same things. And it's really striking when you have people who are studying, when we, not those people out there, when we're studying and writing about things that have to do with the stuff I was talking about here, and we lead lives that are radically opposed, not just tragically, but sometimes cynically opposed. So Newman sees that right up front. He's also concerned about the naivete about evil that I mentioned there. So I gave this talk to, a version of this talk to some parents of students. They're like, well, then why should my kids learn? Why should they study? And so you have to give a response on Newman's account that they're a complex set of goods that are not necessarily easily reducible to one another, and that the good of the intellect is a good. But Newman is worried, right? That passage, quarry the granite rock with razors. Don't think that you're going to be able to put a dent in the pride and passion of human beings simply by that means. So it's a warning. Newman does think that, and this comes out much more if you read Newman's writing about the time that he became rector of University College Dublin. He's very concerned about character formation. And he's very concerned about it in what he calls, he should have probably written another book, not the idea of a university, but the idea of a college, because he sees these as different. They don't exactly map onto our notions, but the university is more about the academic pursuit of truth in a set of disciplines that are related to one another. The collegiate experience, he says, is the residential experience. It's students living together in community and forming one another through friendships for good or for ill. So he's very concerned about the quality of the residential life of students and writes a good bit about this. He was accused by, this is his animosity towards certain Irish prelates, he was accused of being a bit soft on students, even though he's quite serious about formation. And that's because he thought that students should not be kept in a seminary for 4 years or however many years they're in college and then turned loose into the complete freedom of the world. That this had to be for ordinary lay people. It had to be a transition from childhood to adulthood, from a protected environment into full freedom. And so there had to be more freedom offered there than you would have in a convent or a seminary. So Newman is concerned about the issue that Francis is concerned about. He doesn't come down nearly as harshly, obviously, on the intellectual life. I think that what I was trying to show with Francis is that is in a way to underscore another point of Newman's, which is that the university part of liberal education is only part of it. If we're talking about liberal education in its amplitude, that is a being led forth from being bound and blind in various ways to some degree of freedom. A university education can only be part of it. And if we focus exclusively on that part as the key, we're likely to end up the way Aristotle warns us we're going to end up in the opening of the Ethics, right? Which is by thinking that we're good because we know something about ethics, we end up being worse because it blinds us to how we actually become good, and it blinds us to the fact that we're not yet good. And in that, I think Francis and Newman would be in agreement. But it's a great question, and it's a really complicated question, I think. I think Du Bois's own view, which is complicated at various points, really complicated, but I think his own view is actually closer to Newman's, which is that this pondering of life's riddle in the university, in the study of the trivium and the quadrivium, is something that makes us human. And is that book learning? Well, Du Bois seems to think book learning can go a long way as you get from the way in which he weaves a remarkable set of varied traditions into the souls of Black folk. So I think Du Bois is actually closer to Newman. He would disagree with Newman about any number of things, but on that question, I think he's closer to Newman than to Francis in the end. So he's picking up on Francis' broader view. Sorry, that's too long. But
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent
thank
question.
You.
Excellent question.
Hello, thank you. I love that talk. It was really beautiful. I just called up a poem that I hope I haven't lost now. So I'm only looking at my iPhone because I wanted to quote a little bit of it to you. For a while, I was trying to talk to administrators at my institution into renaming freshman orientation, freshman disorientation, because it seemed to me that, I really resonate with the idea that that the need for what we do occurs at the margins, and yet I think that we're all a half step away from the margins. And so this is the end of Philip Larkin's church going. Since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious and gravitating with it to this ground which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. That image of the need for serious thought being awakened and coming in a moment and being there in any life to arise is what I wanted to have you reflect about a little bit. Are there ways in which, far from the margins in socioeconomic terms, this need that is felt so intensely at the margins can be awakened through some kind of disorientation? Thank you.
I think that everybody who's serious about liberal education who's written about it thinks that, right? That there's some moment of disorientation, of the sense that I don't know who I am or where I am. And I don't know, how does it stand with me and others, as Du Bois says it about Francis, right? The world and I, how are we to work together? And that, for most of us, that it certainly did for Francis, right? It came from a deep sense that his life was disordered. And I think someone like Nafisi writing about this, and it's interesting to read Jacob's book about these authors from the 40s, because they all sense that something's missing, right? But they had an education that gave them something that allowed them to name what is missing. If you don't have it's the Wittgenstein line, right? About, which I'm going to sort of misapply for those Wittgensteinian philosophers in the room. It's the Wittgenstein line, right? That the limits of my language mark the limits of my world. And if I don't have a language, or if I'm not hungry for a language that helps me to better describe my predicament, my inability currently to describe where I am and how I stand in relation to myself, others, nature, and God, then it's hard to see how I can move, right? How I can be led forth right? I just end up staying where I am. The greatest example of this, and my colleague Tom Josowitz from the History Department at the University of Dallas gave a talk about this at Alumni Weekend last week, but Frederick Douglass's great experience in the city of Baltimore, right, where he's finally, he's moved from this horrible experience on the Eastern Shore, an absolutely diabolical experience on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, to Baltimore, and the woman there starts teaching him to read, and the husband comes in and says, no, we can't allow that. But then Du Bois is given free time on the streets, right? And he picks up chalk and starts writing words and challenges the white kids to contests. And he experiences this growing capacity in himself, right? To articulate for himself where he is and the deep injustice of slavery, right? He starts to give himself a language that, remember, the opening of that narrative of life begins with him saying all the things he doesn't know about himself because he's been deprived of the knowledge of who his father is, siblings, all of that, right? All these things that he doesn't know, but wishes he could know. And so when the opportunity for education comes his way, he seizes it. And this begins to give him a language eventually to write amazing texts about his own life. But so that experience of disorientation, whatever we might think about Plato's allegory of the cave in the end, right? That experience that I am bound thinking that images that I see are real things when they're not in fact real. That's in a sense the beginning of liberal education. I wanted, about your line though, I wanted to disorganization for, we started a garden of contentment over here by the place. But Patty Orr, the Dean of Libraries, organized that. I said, Patty, faculty are going to be over here. We have to call it the Garden of Discontent. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Hibbs, for your talk. I have a question about kind of your comments regarding the preparation of the university of the student towards civic life, and wondering if you could maybe clarify for me whether or not that entails a kind of more active emphasis or a contemplative emphasis. I think of even the placement of the University of Dallas being in Irving, kind of distanced from the city, even in the Rome campus being kind of distant from the city. So I wonder what.
You're pressing me on my new job here.
Well, I'm curious because in one sense, I really agree that there's supposed to be this kind of preparation, but I don't know. I'm confused as to whether that preparation should be active or should be pragmatic, or if the best present preparation for civic life is contemplative, right? Should it be a kind of retreat? So I don't know if you have some comments on that. That'd be helpful.
Well, I don't think there's a real easy answer to this. I mean, I think college life or certain points in our life, I don't know that the collegiate experience as it's been defined historically is of the essence of this. But they're certainly, liberal education is certainly characterized by moments and then extended periods that are, in a sense, withdrawn from immediate practical concerns. This is the connection with leisure, and hence the connection historically with aristocratic life. But if we think about, let's not think about class issues just for the moment, although we could bring those back up. Let's think about the way, where'd my precious go here? The way we're all addicted to this stuff, right? Can you really think as a student or as a faculty member if you're, as the line Eliot has in the Four Quartets, distracted from distraction by distraction, which is what our experience, at least mine, so often is here. We need moments where we withdraw from certain kinds of immediacy. Now, there might be all sorts of things press on us that we're not allowed to do that, right? But it's really crucial for, again, with Douglass, right, that he gets out of that Eastern Shore tyrant that he's under, and who is a Christian, allegedly, right? That he gets out from under that in part because he has no moment of intellectual freedom that is not taken up by fear or tactics to get away from this tyrant and defend himself. Right now, it's crucial that he defend himself. And in fact, one of the great moments for him in that story is when he actually physically takes on this person and fights against him. But he needs moments where he can step back. And the great experience for him is when he gets sent back to the Eastern Shore after being in Baltimore, and he sets up a Sunday school where they're reading scripture, and he talks about this community of great scholars that he was among, right, and friends, and where they're given a kind of freedom to engage in some things that are properly human. Reading, thought, reflection. Simply for its own sake and for its beauty and for connecting with other human beings through thought and speech. So that's indispensable to liberal education. How that works out, particularly in terms of the setting, the time period, I think that's all flexible.
Thank you very much for the talk. Really a tour de force. Thanks. The language of marginalization, or the margins, is interesting in your talk because you gave a few examples right at the beginning of things outside higher education altogether, like the Dante Society and the Mission, and you quoted a lot of authors who come from traditionally marginalized groups of one sort or another. So I understand the margins in that respect, but I think inside all of that, what part of what you're saying to us, you didn't quite come right out and say this, but I think you're saying that despite the fact that when you look around this room, this doesn't look like a particularly marginalized crowd, that there's a certain sense in which church-related higher education is operating at the margins in the way that Newman would suggest, right? It's got other things going on besides the pursuit of technocratic knowledge for its own good in the Benthamite kind of picture. So I hear that. If that's what you're suggesting to us, I guess I want to ask two questions. One is, how can a sort of upper class white crowd like us really make that kind of claim? It feels a little disruptive to do that. But if we can, or if we can find a way to do it in an intelligent way, what are some of the things that we need to do to keep from losing that margin, whatever marginality we found that way? Because I think church-related higher education in a lot of places is under a lot of pressure to not be at the margins anymore, right? To push itself into the center in one way or another, whether that's by having a really great football stadium at your place, or if it's by recruiting from a larger range of students than might have been traditionally the case, or separating yourself from your founding denomination, or whatever it might be, right? So I wondered if you'd speak to those questions. Thanks.
The only football stadium that was in yeah.
Paul Quinn, right?
Paul Quinn, yeah. Cowboy, the Cowboy Stadium that was in Irving.
Okay. Paul Quinn also got rid of theirs.
Okay. That's a really good question. And yeah, I mean, I'm observing people at the margins who are talking about these things, and I find that interesting. It does seem to me that if I had to pick a few texts about liberal education written by Americans, Douglas's narrative and Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk would be in the top 5. I mean, there's just absolutely no question about that. And so when I read those for the first time to teach them in a kind of interdisciplinary core class at Boston College, I started thinking, well, why is that? What is it about their own experience that leads them to recover certain kinds of insights that the vast majority of people in the culture are just ignoring or repudiating? And as I said, I don't think there's any necessary connection between the margins and recognition of liberal education. It's a contingent one, but it shows up a good bit. And I do think that I think this is true in our culture, and then maybe I can say something about university life, that we've opted for really simplistic views of freedom. I think we can agree on that. Sort of across the political spectrum, we've opted for really simplistic views of freedom. So, in those passages from Douglas understands and Dr. Josowitz made this argument last week in his presentation, that he understands that in some sense, even though he's still enslaved in Baltimore, because he can start to learn, he's free. Now, he's not fully free, and that makes him even more angry about the other types of freedom that are taken away from him. It's not, oh, okay, I'm good now because I can read some books, right? But he's free even though he doesn't have the kind of freedom that we all take for granted. And he's freer than most of us because he understands that the cost of freedom, and he understands that it's complex, and he understands that you can be internally free and externally restrained, and vice versa, right? That you could, the lesson for us, our culture, is the way in which you can be externally free, but internally still enslaved. That's what people like Douglas see that we don't see in our culture. And so being pushed to the margins for some enables them to have a much deeper insight about freedom and its complexity and its costs. In university life, I think one of the ways that I don't have any difficulty with scholarship, with research, I think these are all great things. I think one of the things we have to fight to do in university settings is to keep the spirit of noble amateurism alive. That sense that in certain respects, we're all beginners. Good philosophers from Socrates on have always had that, right? The sense that we're always, this is why, nobody wants to study philosophy anymore. You don't make any progress. But the sense in which we're all beginners, but the root of that is not just beginners, it's lovers, right? The sense in which we're all lovers of learning, and the sense in which it matters to us as teachers when we have those moments of communal discovery in a class. And it's not that we figured out and the final answer to maybe we've just learned how to formulate the question better, or we've seen a text in a different way, and it's been through the conversation with the students that this has emerged. That sense of discovery and of intellectual freedom leading to discovery through conversation with others, that's at the heart of liberal education. And a technocratic model, which is not really present and dominant in the minds of great scientists either, right? Their products might be treated in this way, but great scientists are working often with others and coming to really deep insight about complicated problems. So it's not just the humanities versus the sciences. But that's one of the things that I would say. I think it's also, this notion of our being at the margins is important for us to, as Christians, to remember who we serve, both above and around us. I love to, this friendship class that I had great fun with my wife teaching here at Baylor for a number of years. One of the texts we read in that was Dorothy Day's Long Loneliness. And it's a great text because we're talking all about friendship, and the kids are starting to realize they don't really have any friends, at least as defined by Aristotle, or maybe they got none. Maybe they've never been a friend. And those are good insights, but they can get this idea that the goal is to have just great friendships where you're leading these rich communal lives constantly. And Dorothy Day's saying, no, at least for Christians, that's not the way it works. That loneliness is an enduring part of what it means to be Christian. And that also has to do with ordering our lives toward the face of the poor and avoiding the abstractions of both the right and the left about the poor. And those are the passages that I always find the most challenging in Day's writings. But for Christians, we can't forget that, right? And to the extent that we get caught up in any kind of technocratic paradigm, we can lose that. And if we lose that, we lose who we are.
So first of all, I want to thank you for, through Douglas, legitimizing the trope of the angry black man. I appreciate that so much. That was much funnier in my head, by the way. So one of the things I'm interested in, though, is how that you see in Douglas, and you also see in Ellison, this idea of what I would call a sort of productive disagreement, productive conflict. In fact, as you remember, Douglas learns about reading and literacy that helps him critique slavery, but also helps him to critique the liberal paternalism of the abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who didn't believe that he was capable of editing a newspaper. So it seems to me that a part of what you're getting at is that this kind of almost heuristic use of conflict will inevitably lead us to more conflict. And it helps me remember what Kenneth Burke says about his definition of rhetoric being identification that is born out of conflict. So I'm coming to the question to ask, how do we sell, how do we articulate this idea that in the liberal arts institutions, we welcome conflict, but we welcome them for the kind of self-realization we will achieve and the kind of community that is only born through that conflict?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And also, what are the conditions in our community that make that possible, right? What are the conditions one of the things I think that's gone in most university education is and maybe legitimately, is any sense of trust of the students toward the institution and toward faculty. Right? Now, maybe we shouldn't go back to a day when students just took notes and revered the doctor professor. But I think this view of liberal education is, while it's also connected to conflict, it's also connected to some element of trust in what you just said, right? That this can lead to important things. I don't know how to answer that fully, but it strikes me as a really complicated. I'll say something about Ellison's Invisible Man, which I think is just a series of conflicts, right? One group seems non-paternal and then it becomes paternal. Every group is problematic. And yet Ellison ends that book, or Invisible ends that book, back underground, right? But not cutting off the possibility of discourse. Too many people read that. People read it as nominalist. People read it as a kind of rejection. But the last line is, who knows but on another frequency, I speak for you. So there's the hope there of communication. It hasn't yet happened, but something in that experience of all those conflicts, which are verbal, emotional, violently physical, racial, sexual, everything is in that book. Despite, and maybe because he's going through all that, he still has reason to hope in the end that there can be communication. Maybe we're not on the same frequency yet, but maybe what you're hearing on a different frequency, we could get there. And it's a really it's deeply critical of the American aspiration for happiness in some ways, and yet there's a version of hope in that book, and that's, it's connected with Louis Armstrong and jazz, and it's my favorite novel to teach because it's just so rich, and I think it still speaks as much to us today as it did then. How do we allow for the conflict that simultaneously, even when it feels like things are breaking down, still reaches out and hopes for and actually believes in communication and friendship? Thank you.
This has been a wonderful gathering. Precious time together. And we're so grateful for your presence. I want to thank each and every one of you who were a part of this conference, the Symposium, the LFP conference. I want to thank so many of you who contributed papers and chaired sessions with the Symposium. I want to thank Elizabeth Corey, Christian Miller, Candace Vogler, Francis Sue, Beth Newman, Tom Hibbs, so many of you who really enriched the conversation about this very important topic. I want to thank again Joe Goss, Joe Creech, Jenna Van Sickle, the wonderful people with the Lilly Fellows Program in the humanities and the arts. Have just been a joy to work with for these months. Years have gone into this. I went back and looked at my email. I think the first correspondence we had on this was sometime in 2015. And we're just really thrilled to have had a chance to do all of this. I want to thank my colleagues in the Provost's office. I want to thank Nancy Brickhouse. Thank you for coming today. I want to thank Jim Benninghoff for being a really wonderful colleague and a dear friend. I want to thank Doug Henry for his continued friendship, and Don Schmeltikoff, thanks for leading us forth in so many of these efforts during your time as provost. I want to thank my staff, the folks I get to work with. As I said as we began, someone asked me a few days ago, did I have enough people around to do something like this? And I said, I don't know if I have enough, but I have the right ones. And I really have. Lori Knitz, will you please stand? Lori's our assistant director. She's a tremendous colleague, helps us so much to think in faithful ways about all of our programs, and she and I have been able to do some really phenomenal. She has done phenomenal work, and I have watched her do phenomenal work, and I'm really grateful to have her as a colleague. Matthew Bixler, standing right back there. Matthew's really talented. He's working on. He has a couple of degrees. He's working on another one. He also has experience in the United States Marines, and that came in really handy. I think he gets at least partial credit towards some sort of degree in organizational project design or something like that. So, my goodness, to the logistics of this, I really can't explain to you, and that's why I had Matthew around. Nathan Hayes. Nathan Hayes has come on lately as our project coordinator in the Institute, and also working with me on the Soundings Project, which is a grant that we're administering through the Lilly Endowment. Nathan is a proud graduate of Baylor University and a Crane Scholar, and so to have him back is a great gift as well. Peter Federer, Claire Gostomski, Rachel Kilgore, Wesley Gary, those are undergraduate and graduate assistants. If you're here, please stand. They've been a real delight to work with, and just a great source of joy, and have helped in all matter and sorts of things. So before I say one more thing about someone else, and then I want to do two things. I want to invite you next year to our conference, which we'll make the date known just as soon as we can. These things end up being contingent on Big 12 football schedules. The character of the university. Even our Spirit and Sports Conference had to be on an away or an off week. We'll do that next October. Steve Evans, who is here, and Byron Johnson received a wonderful grant from the Templeton Foundation on doing really important work to think about the virtue of accountability, being both accountable to God and accountable to one another. So we'll do a conference next year on living accountably, and we're looking forward to that. And we'll let you know the date. We have some speakers already lined up for that, and we'll let you know all of that in due course. I'm not quite ready to think about 2020 yet. If July 20, 1969, and we celebrated the 50th anniversary of this. Three guys landed on the moon with a whole lot of men and women who made that possible. In 1962, John Kennedy gave a rousing speech at Rice University. And she asked the question, why do we go to the moon? Why does Rice play Texas? Not go to the moon because it is easy, but because it is hard. Do it because it places upon us challenges that exercise our capacities, challenges that we cannot postpone, challenges that we must accept. Doing this conference was a little like trying to put someone on the moon, it felt at times. We could not have done it without Vicki Schultz. Vicki told me sometime last summer that she was going to retire in January of 2020 if this conference didn't do it. She was already ready. So why do we do all this? We do all this because we believe we're called to do it. Cannot do it alone. A colleague of mine said conferences are a very inefficient use of time. Exactly. The work we do, that we're called to do, that we're blessed to do, cannot be done apart from the context of community and real friendship. So we are blessed to be able to be a gathering place for you all, and we are blessed by your friendship. Thank you very much. For those of you who are a part of the LFP group, we'll convene across the hall at 2:55 for your final small group sessions. For those of you who've been a part of the symposium audience, we'll see you next year. God bless you all, and thank you so much.
Friends, just one moment. I think there's one more word of thanks that we should make. We couldn't do this without outstanding leadership at the very top, someone who exemplifies the virtues, intellectual, moral, and Christian, and that's Darren Davis. So please join me in thanking him for a job well done.